This episode contains discussion of violence, sexual assault, murder, crime scenes, and offensive language in the context of quotes from serial killer Samuel Little. Listener discretion is strongly advised. This is The Fall Line. Last episode, we promised to bring you a full update on the developments in the Samuel Little cases, what's happened since our series aired in September of 2019, and how the open cases that have been tied to the now-deceased killer stand today. To do that, we've brought on the Fall Line's senior research assistant, Bryan Worters. Bryan's been with the show for 2 years now. He was actually hired specifically because of his incredible knowledge of and archival research on Samuel Little's crimes and on the victims, both known and unknown, that have been reported on in the media since 2018. Bryan, who's an investigative genetic genealogist and graduate student studying criminology and criminal justice, is a true Samuel Little expert. We've had reporters, law enforcement, podcasters, and others come to us to tap Bryan for information on Little's victims, his timeline, and a host of other information. I sat down with Bryan in early March to talk about the developments in all of the cases. We largely focused on the Southeast, but did make sure to touch on national news as well. So, Bryan, I actually hired you as a researcher for the Fall Line through our mutual experience working with the Transdo Task Force, me as a colleague and you as a volunteer. I discovered through them that you had a very extensive knowledge of the victims of Samuel Little. But when they told me extensive, I had no idea how much information you'd amassed on your own. After close to 2 years of working with you, I feel confident in saying that you're one of the most informed citizen experts on Little's crimes and victims in the United States, and probably anywhere. Can you tell us how you began your research into Little? When I met you, you'd already developed extensive timelines, victim spreadsheets, just done months and months of research.
When I initially came across Little's case, it was Thanksgiving of 2018. The news had just broken out that Little had confessed to the murders of 93 women, and at that point they'd been able to corroborate 30 of those murders. I had known from prior research, looking at other serial offenders who have had much larger body counts, that this is something law enforcement was taking very seriously. Looking at how they were able to handle cases where the toolbox killer has been brought up, and there's always been speculated victims, things that have been not positively confirmed. Seeing that effort from a department level was absolutely inspiring, and it felt like something that I didn't want to ignore. Because if I could help in any way, shape, or form to be able to compile information for the public, to have this research done, Little's case in and of itself, certainly it's fascinating, but not for the reasons that one would think with his MO or even with his own personal biography. It's done rather more so because of these victims. These are the people who matter, and that's why I started my research to begin with, to be able to corroborate every single one of these as best as I could, with the intent of making sure people knew what had happened to their loved ones.
When you started out, did you have a clear idea what you might actually do with all this information once you gathered it?
At the time I developed it, I was uploading all of my findings onto web sleuths. I didn't even have a document or a spreadsheet to where it was today until somebody suggested that I put it in a thread that I simply compile everything to one spot. I have more information, and things fell into place very quickly. Just being able to denote information about the victim's sources of the victim's death to speculative information. with 93 victims, there is going to be mixed media reports and coverage that documents if Little confessed to their homicide or speculative nature regarding their connection to Little. So with me, it was very important to be able to have this all in one space for the public to access should they need it. And I didn't think anybody would actually need it, which is why it's been so surprising to see so many developments and so much support and utilization of what I've been able to make.
And I think you've been able to help in some ways that are practical and some ways that are surprising. So obviously, one of the major things you did with this information, as you built it as well, was help us with the Samuel Little series. And also, one of the most valuable contributions you offered was that extremely exhaustive timeline of Little's movements. It's so exhaustive that I don't know if another one like it exists out in the world outside of law enforcement's hands.
What I've been able to do is I've taken a look at documentaries, extensive portfolios. I have dissected nearly every news clip on Samuel Little that was available to the public. And what will pop up on screen will be the rap sheet that law enforcement was able to compile. So a lot of this was simply pausing the screen, taking note of charges, dates, locations, and being able to put it all into one spot.
That's particularly important because we got turned down for almost all our FOIAs, right?
Yes. It was so much more difficult to be able to get information on Little's victims, especially since this is the Southeast. I mean, these were, at that time, and still ongoing investigations, and there has been much that has been kept under wraps because these are connected to America's most prolific serial killer.
And I know it's not only timeline information that you were able to find that was incredibly helpful. You were actually able to find information that was helpful to law enforcement as well, and information that law enforcement didn't have. And I'd love for us to talk about that a little bit, because I think it really taps into something that we've talked about a little bit on the show, but I don't think we got into it in depth, which is the kind of research databases that you and I and perhaps our listeners are really familiar with, but that law enforcement are not necessarily utilizing.
Certainly. With the case of Miriam Eileen Chapman, one of Little's victims who was killed in 1976, law enforcement was looking for information regarding the next of kin. They had the alias of Angela, and Chapman is a very common surname. So with all of the other victims that I've been able to access and have more information readily available on, I took to Ancestry and I took a look at this woman's name. I was able to plug in birth years, death dates, try to be able to find information. And I came across somebody who had one Miriam Eileen Chapman listed in their tree as having died in Miami-Dade. And I came across a treasure trove of available information. I was able to, from this, locate living siblings. I was able to locate her parents, and it was so accessible, and it comes as a second nature as a researcher, as a genealogist, to be able to utilize Ancestry, genealogical databases, or avenues of accessing information that are not typically utilized by law enforcement, which the practice of investigative genetic genealogy is still not one that is readily available at a commercial use or even accepted by all law enforcement agencies. It's still a very new, very young field. So utilizing genealogical avenues, using Ancestry, I don't think that it's been considered heavily as much as it has been now. John Webb of the Evansville Courier and Press took note of the details that were released in the Florida episode that surrounded Miriam's life and details. And from that, he was able to reach out to the Fall Line, and Laura was able to redirect him to me to be able to provide further information. And from there, I was able to get in contact with law enforcement, and I provided all the available information that I had.
Another thing that I just kind of wanted to highlight about the importance of using alternative databases, maybe that law enforcement aren't using as much, or even journalists who are kind of outside of the work that we do, is that you're able to find photos of people that aren't going to be the government photos that we might be so used to. So I know with Miriam's case, they were using a mugshot, and you were actually able to pull a really lovely family photo of her from Ancestry. And that's what's being used with articles about her now, right?
Mm-hmm. With Miriam's case, I had known that the only photo that was circulated about her, much like with some of the other victims of Little, has been a mugshot. And with any individual, to be able to reduce them to a low point, somebody who has been taken in, who has just been detained, and for that to be how the media will portray you in life is, it's so, I've said dehumanizing in Miriam's article for the Miami Herald, but I think about it more and I just consider it so inconsiderate. It it doesn't provide an exact representation. It doesn't encapsulate who Miriam was in life.
Well, it goes back to one of our main thematic focuses, right? On Samuel Little's victims, which is his assumption that no one cared about these women who were on the margins and they were minimized and othered. And I think that as more families are spoken to, right, that becomes obvious that that was one of his many, many lies. I think we have to start with the death of Samuel Little, which came as a pretty big shock, which is strange, I think, because he was a sick, elderly man in prison with COVID raging. But I think it came as a shock more to investigators who were just hoping against the clock to get as much as they could out of him before he passed away. And to my best recollection, he did die in December of 2020, right?
Yes, he died on December 30th.
Oh, right on the edge. And I know the rumor then, and I read it in LA Times, was that he passed away from COVID, but it wasn't confirmed then. Has it ever been confirmed?
Other than the Los Angeles Times, no other source has stated his cause of death or given any information regarding the circumstances of it. So the only information that is available is this LA Times publication.
Some agencies would give up on pursuing leads when a perpetrator died. Has that been the case here, or are they pushing on?
The general consensus and the impression that I've gotten from this passing has been, even though he has died, there is still a sense of interest, of dedication, and a lingering question that they want to be able to answer. Because with 62 confirmed murder victims, there is no doubt that investigators have in looking at his other claims.
In our series, we concentrated on the Southeast, and we covered Southeastern victims. But we know that Little had unmatched confessions and Jane Doe victims tied to him across the U.S., and those cases matter too. So we wanted to give you some time to briefly discuss any major developments that have occurred with open cases outside our region, especially those where authorities are actively seeking help.
The majority of the non-Southeast cases that need to be addressed are centered in California. These are women who were killed in the late 80s, 87 to 96, and these are predominantly Black women. And at this time, knowing the Los Angeles area, uh, law enforcement would be very prone to labeling certain demographics as a NPI case or an NHI case. That's short for no human involved or no person involved. And it keeps on coming to my attention that looking at the women that he described killing, the Texas Department of Public Safety's release on the California victims is heavily based with locations, with street names, with circumstances that, with descriptors and details that would evidently point to a, a murder or a person being discovered. In fact, in some of the California confessions, he believes that he recalled reading about it in the paper the next day. And it comes to a surprise that some of these victims have yet to be confirmed, but I do recognize that this is in part due to the shifting of records that have not been digitized and the availability of open murder cases that may have been classified as a overdose or a accidental death. They've released only 4 victims of Little who they've positively linked to within the Los Angeles area. So that is in stark comparison to the remaining 16 California victims that need to be corroborated. I also want to be able to acknowledge the facts that, as continued before, there is a case in Cuyahoga County, Ohio, that they're still looking to verify. And there is also another case in Nevada that they're still looking to identify, and that is the victims who are not within the Southeast territory. There is much more detail to be found on these victims within the public release or within the press release, but at this time, it seems as if they are undergoing an investigation that has not been made heavily public other than this appeal for information.
And we'll link to that in the show notes. So, have any cases outside the Southeast actually been resolved or matched? Like, has a Jane Doe been identified or a homicide matched to one of Little's confessions?
Yes. When looking at the appeal for information that they released, there is a decent number of victims who have been carefully omitted from the reports. And that to me reads that they have either been identified or they have been located, and they're currently withholding information pending further investigation. I believe that there have been victims that have been confirmed in Arizona, and there have been victims that have been confirmed in Missouri and Arizona.
Now, this is a question you may not be equipped to answer. You certainly don't have to answer for it, but it's something that comes up a lot, I think, when we're looking at a killer whose sheer number of murders is difficult for us to process. And I think this is something that we also tend to kind of worry about, which comes to how much due diligence is done in investigations when confessions are being matched. And I think that goes back to the worry that was instilled with alleged mass serial killers like Henry Lou Lucas or even Tommy Lynn Sells, who both made dozens of false confessions. Do you feel like, just from studying the work that's done around Samuel Little's confessions, that there's a lot of due diligence going into matching his confessions?
I believe that there is. Initially, as is with any other confession killer who is claiming a large body count, investigators were skeptical. I mean, they had Little had confessed to the murder of a woman in Texas by the name of Denise Christie Brothers, and he was able to recount information about the homicide in great detail, and he was doing so while investigators had the report file in front of him. But when he continued to confess to additional murders and the elements were recorded, victims were able to be linked to actual murder victims or people who had died under suspicious circumstances. By the time they announced publicly that they had 30 homicide victims, it seems as if they had enough reasonable doubt to present it to the public to have more information come their way. And with this case, I know that it's also a bit of a double-edged sword. People had their reservations about the confessions because the entity that was able to solicit Little's confessions were also the same people to have solicited information from Henry Lee Lucas. While I understand where many people came from, it simply turned out not to be the case, especially with how many victims were linked to drug overdoses or accidental deaths or lightning strikes. There were details that he was able to provide that were so niche and explicitly linked to an individual's life that he could not lie, or he could not be perceived as fabricating more about this victim.
And were some of these also linked by DNA?
To my knowledge, I do not think that any have been linked to DNA. I mean, Little's DNA is on file. I know that he has been excluded against a perpetrator case for a Jane Doe that was found in Georgia, but other than that, I don't know to what extent DNA, and specifically his DNA, was used to confirm some of these deaths.
Now let's get into the Southeast. I know there were a few major categories of discussion for us to cover: identifications, confession matches, and the cases where new details have been released. So let's go through those by group. Which previously unidentified victims have been identified since our series aired?
The Escatapa Jane Doe, or also known as the Jackson County Jane Doe, has been identified as Clara Birdlong. Through investigative genetic genealogy, she was found. Clara, also known by her relatives as Nutton, was found in a rural area in the Jackson County area, and she had been missing originally from a northern part of the state in LaFleur County. Clara was 44 years old at the time of her death. She had disappeared only a few months prior to that, and she was described by one of her cousins as being fun-loving, having stories that she would share on her travels, and Clara had unique physical characteristics that she possessed in her time as a Jane Doe that would have been noticeable in life, such as an open-faced gold cap on her central incisor. Clara has been identified through the means of investigative genetic genealogy. Her case, while the investigation is still ongoing to be able to pinpoint her last known whereabouts and movements, her family has been notified.
How many total still unidentified women in the Southeast are linked to Samuel Little?
As of today's date, or at least at the time of this publication, there are 4 Jane Does who have yet to be identified that are currently within the Southeast. There is the Bibb County Jane Doe, who was located in Georgia in 1977. She is a Black female between the ages of 28 and 52. There is a woman potentially named either Donna or Sarah, who was located in Miami-Dade, Florida in 1971. She was believed to be 18 to 25 years old, and She is Little's second known victim. Another victim that was found was the Orleans Parish Jane Doe, a white female who was located in Little Woods, Louisiana, between the ages of 34 to 44. And lastly, there is the West Memphis Jane Doe, otherwise known as the Crittenden County Jane Doe, who was discovered in 1990. She is believed to be between the ages of 20 and 50 years old.
And I know from our conversations that we've had, you have reason to believe that at least one of the four women you mentioned may have been identified, right? And that it hasn't been announced yet. Who is it, and why do you have that suspicion?
The Crittenden County Jane Doe, 1990, her NamUs page has been down. It's no longer listed as accessible. And this is in part due to the investigating agency who sent her DNA along with with familial relatives of three missing women to be compared to against the Jane Doe. It is my assumption that one of the women has been identified as the Jane Doe, and the department's still in the midst of conducting their investigation.
So, just so listeners can understand, we've talked about NamUs on the show plenty of times before, but for people who have NamUs profiles, and anyone can start one, folks like Bryan and I, who are your average everyday researchers, we just have normal profiles, and our colleagues, anthropologists like Dr. Amy Michael, they have more professional profiles and can see more. Once we log in, we have the ability to track cases. So obviously, I track the Millbrook twins, any case we've ever worked on for the show. And one thing we do keep track of is when a page disappears, so it will no longer exist on the site. And something that is sort of tracked in the research, and also I would say the citizen detective community, is that being kind of a sign that a case solve is going to be announced soon. I mean, obviously, it's not a perfect science. Sometimes it's simply an error or something's going to be re-uploaded, but it is something we keep an eye on.
Mm-hmm. Taking into account the circumstances of the Jane Doe's testing and the public information they made available about the comparisons they would be making to family members of three or so missing women, it would be fair to assume that they have been able to make a confirmation and they're simply waiting a announcement pending confirmation or investigative processes.
I know that you pointed me towards a certain press release by the Texas Department of Public Safety, I think it was, where they were specifically asking for help on cases. And that's where you noticed something kind of interesting, right? How many total cases were they asking for help with?
The report listed 31 uncorroborated victims, and in going through the list, I was able to take note of the absence of some cases that were previously covered on the show. One of those women being the Tampa dope girl, a uncorroborated victim who was killed in Miami, Florida. And interestingly enough, another case that was more extensively covered was the case of a woman who Little believed was named Ruth, who was killed in Arkansas in '94. And intuitively, it leads me to believe that they have since either been identified or they have a primary candidate for the identity of those victims. So only time will tell whether or not those details are released.
And how many unmatched confessions does that leave total in the South now?
That would leave 13 remaining uncorroborated victims in the Southeast.
I know that most folks haven't gone back and listened to our whole series in preparation for this interview, but if there are a few of the unmatched confessions where you feel that new details have been added that truly might aid in identification, it might be helpful for you to share those now and maybe list them by state and mention the woman involved and what those identifying details might be.
There are several remaining victims predominantly located in Florida, that have had much more detail added to their cases. One victim, who was previously known as Homestead Air Force Base, has now been given a little bit more detail. Little describes that he, while in Miami, met a woman who was killed in either 71 or 72, or even potentially around 78 to 79. Little described dating a quote-unquote dark-skinned Haitian woman. He described her as being 26 to 28, standing between 5'4" and 5'8", and weighed approximately 120 to 130 pounds. He described the black female's hair as being in a knot-like hairstyle, quote-unquote plaited up, short, and quote-unquote kind of braided, and quote-unquote straight, stiff. He picked up the woman who may have been soliciting sex or at a bar in Homestead. The bar was, in his words, off the highway and had a liquor part and a bar part. He described the woman as little skinny woman and quote unquote, not feminine, but just a hardworking woman. He stated the woman worked as a civilian employee, potentially even a janitor at the Homestead Air Force Base. He took the woman to the woods on military property, give or take 1/2 mile away from the bar. And he thought that the road was a dirt one and on the property of the Air Force. After strangling the woman, he left the body of the woman either on the base property in some weeds, approximately a block from the main road, or in a field near the base outside of Miami. He said that he left the woman, quote unquote, in the woods and did not think water was too far from where he would have left the body. He believed that the body would have been found. Another victim that received scant coverage that was previously discussed in the podcast is the case of a woman by the name of Emily. She was described as a black female who was killed in the early to mid 1970s. He described the woman as approximately 23 to 24 years of age, about 5'6", and weighed about 130 pounds. He had picked up Emily at the same bar where he had previously picked up Marianne, a transgender woman who was previously covered in earlier coverage. He'd seen Emily with a University of Miami student identification card. He had driven the woman down Highway 27, and he described this area as having trash lying on both sides. He started arguing and physically began to assault the woman, and this victim hit him in the mouth. Little then went on to state that he snapped and he had hit her several times before strangling her to death and subsequently putting a mattress over her body. He had thrown her purse into a nearby field with tall, quote-unquote, elephant grass in it. He had stated that a white man observed him discarding the woman's belongings, and he never heard of the body being discovered. The last case in Florida that has had a substantial amount of detail added to it since his passing is the case of a woman who was found either in Tampa Bay or Clearwater, Florida, in approximately 1977 or 78, or even potentially 1983 to 1984. Little described encountering a 23-year-old, 5'5", 140 to 160 pound, short, quote unquote, chubby black female in a bar either in St. Petersburg or Clearwater. He was driving a black Thunderbird at that time and described the woman as having, quote unquote, leather colored skin. He had stated the woman was wearing some revealing shorts but wanted to go home and change. He drove the woman to her residence in a quote-unquote black neighborhood somewhere so she could change, and when he arrived at the scene, he stated that about 5 of her little siblings, sisters and brothers, came running out, yelling his name. He then drove the woman to a secluded, grassy, wooded area not far along from this beach, with railroad tracks nearby, possibly outside of Tampa parameters and in the direction of Plant City. He stated that he saw buildings and then he saw vegetation. Little drove the woman to, quote unquote, an island of grass, round with a curb around it, and he found this grassy lane with some grass and woods back there. He had parked, observed a railroad track run across the general area, and he dumped the woman right by the railroad track. He stated that he left the woman wearing a quote unquote tight miniskirt and a blouse, and he had kept her undergarments. He also left the woman lying on her back with her arms over her head, and that he could hear the train from the location where he discarded the woman's body. Little described 2 murders in the Atlanta, Georgia area that previously had scant coverage and details available about their deaths. This first victim, Little described as a woman he had killed in 1981. He described the woman as a black female with quote unquote mahogany skin, the color of leather. She was approximately in her late 20s to late 30s, at about 5'6" to 5'9", and weighed 130 to 160 pounds, and wore quote unquote shorts made to look like a dress. He had danced with a woman in a bar on Auburn Avenue and believed the black female was having problems with her boyfriend or a significant other. She agreed to leave with Little, but did not want anybody to see them leaving the bar together. She sat on the right front fender and began to cry. She got into the car after some time, and she looked around just to make sure nobody saw her getting in, and then laid down to further ensure that nobody would see her. She directed Little to drive down to Interstate 75 and headed south into the county. Little did not think he drove too far before exiting the highway into a side street that was under construction. He described the road as, quote unquote, wide but lonesome. There weren't any houses, nothing but trees on the road right off the highway. He had followed the road until it dead-ended, parked in an area with woods on both sides of the road. He had choked the woman, and he had carried her body across the street and laid her down into the grass approximately 10 feet from the woods. He stated that he left the woman with her clothes on and her eyes closed like she was asleep.
Is this the case that he described previously as Atlanta Black or Atlanta College?
This is the woman he described as Atlanta Black. This second case that he previously described as Atlanta College is the instance of a black woman that he had killed in 1984, or approximately 1984. He had described her as 22 to 25 years old, quote unquote slim and tall, standing at about 5'9", and weighed 120 to 130 pounds. He had met her at a quiet bar on the corner of Auburn Street, and he remembered that when he entered the bar, the woman was sitting in a booth. He thought that the woman told him that she went to college because she was angry about something that happened while she was in school. And he went through her wallet later on and found out that she did attend a college. He then went on to, quote unquote, make a date with the woman. They drove together on a highway, in his words, way out, until he exited onto a little dirt road surrounded by canals. He strangled the woman, and he then proceeded to travel further into the woods, which ran adjacent to a canal, which was barely enough for 2 cars to get by. He had placed the woman's body in the canal, and he stated that she probably hung up on something down there. They probably saw her the next day, and he believed that she was wearing a dress and that he threw her boxy purse into the water with her. There is a remaining case that needs to be linked in Louisiana that previously had scant detail that now has much more detail. This is the account of a woman who Little claims to have killed sometime after 1987, before 1993. He says that he took a Greyhound bus into Monroe and he stayed at a shelter downtown for 2 to 3 days. He stole meat from the neighborhood in Monroe and sold it in the quote-unquote black neighborhood, which he said the locals referred to as the quote-unquote embankment. This area was across the street from a graveyard and near some railroad tracks. He said this woman was between 20 to 24 years old, stood between 5'6" and 5'10", and weighed about 150 to 160 pounds, and possessing a quote-unquote yellow or light complexion. He stated that the woman was a sex worker who worked for a madam named, in his words, Mammy Way. Little took the woman to a hotel where she signed on her name for the registry to either room number 8 or 9. And the following day, he convinced this woman to go with him into the wooden shack or garage across the street from McDonald's that was just further down from the big graveyard. Little stated that this garage was near a bus stop and about 1 mile from the bus station that was located from the county on the outskirts of town. Because the garage was locked, they had to crawl in through a dog door, and in this garage there were paint supplies, ladders, tools, and what have you. He stated that he strangled the woman to death and left her body inside of the shed, and he had left her on the floor of the garage between several ladders and bit her, which caused her to bleed. He said that a day or two after he'd killed her, he had seen yellow crime scene tape around the garage and immediately left town. When he revisited Monroe on a later trip, he said that the garage had been torn down and the area was now a vacant lot. He stated they were in the process of tearing down many of the buildings in that area, but the McDonald's was still there. And that is the M3 Monroe girl.
The next victim Bryan discusses was mentioned on our show as Gulfport Woman. That's what Samuel Little labeled her portrait.
In Mississippi, Little states that approximately in the late 70s to 1984, while driving his black Thunderbird, he picked up a, in his words, pretty dark-skinned girl in Gulfport, Mississippi. The woman was described as being between the ages of 22 to 25. She was short but wide, in his words, with a very attractive physique, who stood between 5'3" and 5'5", and weighed 120 to 130 pounds. He said the woman was soft-spoken, sophisticated, clean, and intelligent-looking, with, in his words, a beautiful personality. He'd met the woman at a bar in what he described as a black projects area of Turkey Creek, approximately 2 blocks away from where Highway 49 is. He parked outside the bar. The woman approached him and asked if she could get in, and he believed that she was angry, potentially at a boyfriend or a spouse or a partner. So he drove her to a restaurant on Highway 49 and bought her dinner. Little described driving a few blocks towards Sawaya City until he came to an isolated area that may have been a park where the grass was cut low and good. He strangled the woman in his vehicle, pulled her out of the car, and placed her body onto an island of grass encased in concrete. He stated the woman also carried a butcher knife that fell out in his car, so he put the knife point down in the ground next to her and pushed the handle into it until it disappeared. He believed that he left the woman clothed in a skirt and a blouse.
The title for the portrait of the final unconfirmed victim is Girl in Gully, Knoxville, 1990, Vine Street.
The last victim that has had further information come out that was previously not discussed in our coverage is that of a woman who he described as killing in Knoxville, Tennessee. In approximately January of 1975, he met a black female who was about 25 years of age, stood 5'5" to 5'6", and weighed 120 to 130 pounds, was medium-sized in his words, with quote-unquote golden-colored skin and a short, quote-unquote non-Afro style hair. He stated he met the woman in a black neighborhood or at a graveyard, possibly around the 4th Avenue. He drove the woman to a road that ran around a deep gully or hole, overgrown with trees and weeds with potential rubbish, refrigerators, stoves, and other trash within this area. He thought the gully was within 1/2 of Vine Street near the Black Projects, in his words. He stated that he strangled the woman to death and rolled her body into the gully. He believed the woman was possibly clothed in pants and a blouse.
So, 2 final questions for you, Bryan. And once again, I know that you are not someone who can speak to all of these things as law enforcement or a victim's advocate, but I think you can speak to them as someone who's thoughtfully considered all of these cases. What have you learned from all the work you've done on these cases, whether it's about law enforcement, society, cold cases, or just anything else you'd like to share with our audience?
There has been, with Little's case, in my opinion, a very heavy retroactive effort to be able to take into account the circumstances in which Little was able to thrive and succeed in. There is a level of care and precaution that many investigating agencies are still holding on to in hopes of being able to resolve cases. It's of the utmost importance that people recognize the circumstances in which these women were living, some even surviving in, and how they were able to unfortunately fall victim to a man who saw them as nothing more but sexual gratification. And these women truly, for one reason or another, they may have been viewed at that time as being on the margins of society. The biggest thing that I've taken away from this with law enforcement is that there is such a gap in communication between agencies and the digitization of records. There have been many identifications made by looking at old records, shifting through paper copies. The case of Frances Campbell in Savannah, Georgia, was solved purely because investigators looked through death records that had not been digitized. That's possibly to say that there are victims out there that have yet to be corroborated who have not had that same benefit of being able to have such a thorough investigation conducted, or records have been lost, or they have not been yet digitized. It would be not only beneficial for any of Little's cases, but this could be able to help clear many other cases that have fallen through the cracks because their cases have not yet been transferred into the digital age.
So last question, Bryan. I know you've heard me ask countless experts this, but to me, and I think to many of our listeners, you are an expert on this. So in your expert opinion, how do you think our audience can support the ongoing identification of the victims of Samuel Little?
Personally, I would love to be able to see a production done on the remaining victims who have not been corroborated or identified yet. To specifically focus on them I think that would be very beneficial in generating more tips.
Thanks so much to Senior Research Assistant Bryan Worters for his valuable time, information, insight, and effort. If you know of a case that should be covered on the Fall Line, there's a link to our case submission form in the show notes. Thank you for listening. The Fall Line is a fully independent show, and we appreciate listener support. It allows us to do research, obtain FOIA, pay our content advisors, and support and donate to the causes we care about. If you try out the products we advertise, please use our sponsor codes. It really helps. And if you'd like to support the show and the stories we cover, join us over on Patreon. We're raising funds to continue to pay for the Millbrook Twins billboard and to build a therapy fund for families who've been on the show. Each and every one of our patrons helps us to continue this work, and we're so grateful for your help. On Patreon, you can get early release ad-free versions of our regular episodes, plus blogs and videos for only $5 a month. We've also added video live streams which all patrons can enjoy, starting at just $1. The Fall Line is written, hosted, and researched by Laura Norton, with additional research by Bryan Worters, Kim Fritz, and Kiana Burgess. Interviews by Brooke Hargrove. Produced, engineered, and scored by Maura Curry. Content advisement by Brandy C. Williams, Liv Fallon, and Vic Kennedy. And, as always, our most special thanks to Angie Dodd. Currently, our monthly donation is going to private investigations for the missing. Please, join us in supporting this nonprofit. They need funds to help families access the service of private investigators.